Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
So hi everyone. Welcome to our webinar on Oceania offsetting trends. So thank you all for tuning in. If you can't stay for the entire webinar, or if you have colleagues who can't make it tonight, don't worry. We're going to have this webinar recorded, and we will make it available at foresttrends.org sometime next week. Also, if you have any questions during this webinar, please write them in the question box that you should see on your screen. So I'll begin this webinar by sharing our regional offsetting insights for Oceania based on two new reports that came out in 2017. The first being our State of the Voluntary Carbon Markets Regional Analysis Report, and the second being our State of the Forest Carbon Finance 2017 report. Following me will be three panelists, Tim Moore, Ollie Belton, and Sean Weaver, who will speak more about their experiences with the voluntary and compliance markets in Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. So I'm really excited for them to share their insights with you all. And then finally, at the end, we should have about 10 to 15 minutes to answer questions. So just once again, if you have any questions during the webinar, write them down, and we will get to it at the end of the webinar. So before we begin, I'd like to recognize the supporters and sponsors of those two reports. So all of our reports are freely available thanks to sponsors like the ones listed here. So for those of you unfamiliar with Ecosystem Marketplace, brief background, we're a program of the nonprofit Forest Trends, and we produce reports and articles covering the latest trends in ecosystem markets and conservation finance. So I'll be presenting regional offsetting trends based on the information in the two reports shown here in three webinars. So this is the first, which is about Oceania offsetting trends, but we will also have webinars next week and the week after that look at Latin America and North America offsetting trends. So if you're interested in those, please do register. The voluntary carbon offset information will come from the report on the left, the State of the Voluntary Carbon Markets 2017 Regional Analysis, and the forest carbon compliance information I'll be presenting in later slides will come from the State of Forest Carbon Finance 2017 report shown here on the right. So we define Oceania as Australia, New Zealand, East Timor, and the Pacific Islands. And what this slide shows are the different types of markets for forest carbon offsets around the world. So if you look at the Oceania area, you can see that voluntary offsetting can occur anywhere in the region. That's shown by the pink outlines here. And aside from that, there are only two countries with compliance forest carbon markets, and those are Australia and New Zealand. So for my presentation, I'm going to first focus on the voluntary carbon offset findings for all of Oceania, and then turn to discuss some of the compliance market trends we're seeing in Australia and in New Zealand. So what this slide shows are voluntary carbon offset information across all offset types, so not just forest carbon. The bulk, 96% of last year's volume came from Australia. So that was 535,000 tons that we tracked being transacted last year. About half of those were from forestry offsets, and those transacted at an average of $9.8 per ton, that's US dollars. And the other half were represented by renewable energy offsets, which typically transacted at an average of $1 per ton. So as you can see, that what happened in Australia basically made up the entirety of the volume you see on this slide, and also was pretty much the main impetus for the average price that you see there of $4.9 per ton. The remaining 4% transacted almost came completely from afforestation, reforestation, or REDD+ projects. And these came from projects based in New Zealand, East Timor, Fiji, and Vanuatu. Unfortunately, each of those countries was only home to one or two transactions in each country, so we can't disclose any more information about that here because our policy is we need at least 3 different data points to disclose information. But the standards associated with those offsets sold included the gold standard, the ISO 14064, and Plan Vivo. And also kind of exciting within that was the first REDD+ transactions from the Pacific Islands, which panelist Sean Weaver should speak more about in a little bit. So turning just to what's happening in Australia. Australia's had a bit of a wild ride with offset policies. So I'm not going to talk about all the things happening here, but essentially the country's carbon tax began in 2012, only to be repealed in 2014. And then that government then established an emissions reduction fund. So the basic idea behind the emissions reduction fund was that instead of the businesses having to pay for offsets through this carbon tax, the government would take on the cost and would hold an auction to purchase offsets from project developers in Australia. So most of the fund's original $1.6 billion, again USD, has been spent in the last 5 auctions to purchase offsets from all different types of project types. And future funding is unknown. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the ERF in the future. So what this table shows is compliance forest carbon offset transactions in Australia and sort of what we've tracked over the last 3 years. So as you can see in this table, the contracted volume of offsets really jumped from 2014 to 2015. And that's because of what I was just saying. In 2014, we were tracking transactions of offsets by regulated corporations. And in 2015, the government started to contract offsets under the Emissions Reduction Fund. So under the ERF, there are typically about 2 auctions a year. In 2016, the 2 auction average prices were $7.3 per ton and $7.6 a ton for what the government paid for these offsets. And then sort of what we're watching in the future. So as I mentioned, in 2017, there weren't any budget proposals that included additional financing for the ERF. So sort of the future of those auctions is, I guess, a little bit in doubt. Another thing that we're keeping an eye on is the government also introduced what's called a safeguard mechanism for the ERF in 2016, which could potentially shift the fund back into a cap and trade program in the future by essentially putting limits on Australia's most polluting organizations. However, so far, these corporations have been able to use some legal loopholes to not have to actually participate in the safeguard mechanism. So far we haven't seen any corporate action to purchase offsets, compliance offsets because of that, but that's something that perhaps could change in 2018. So in contrast to Australia, New Zealand's policies around carbon offsetting have been a bit more stable. However, the one sort of big thing that we've been keeping an eye on recently is in 2015 and 2016, the government started undergoing a review of their cap and trade program. And some decisions are still going to be made in 2018. So a couple of the topics that were originally under review, one was called the 2-for-1 rule. So it was developed when there was the worldwide economic recession and essentially allowed emitters to surrender only 1 allowance for every 2 tons of carbon dioxide emitted. So that decision was already made to phase out that measure. But then the other 2, I think, are still probably up in the air, but I'm hoping Ollie Belton might be able to give a little bit more up-to-date information. The second one is that foreign offsets. So international offsets had unrestricted access to the New Zealand market starting in 2010. And prior to the influx of those offsets, there were really high prices being sold for typically forest carbon offsets sold within the market. And prices were typically around $20 per ton. And after foreign offsets came into the market, the prices dropped dramatically, sometimes less than $1 a ton. So that's something that it's unclear post-2020 if foreign offsets will be allowed back into the market. Another also potential action item that's been discussed by the government is perhaps putting on a price floor so there aren't so many wild price fluctuations, which have been experienced in the New Zealand market in the past. So as you can see here, we also saw some interesting activity going on between 2014 to 2015. So once again, this table is showing the information we collected around New Zealand, forest carbon, offsets and allowances only, so no other project types. But you can see that there was quite a big jump in the forestry offsets being retired between 2014 and 2015. So in between that time was when international offsets were no longer able to be sold within the program. And as you can see, the demand for forest carbon really started to go up and continued to go up in 2016, where we tracked, or the government of New Zealand announced that there were 15.5 million tons of forestry NZUs that were retired, which is obviously quite a big jump from 0.8 in 2014. So this slide I just sort of made just to show the differences between the two programs. They're both interesting in their own way, but they sort of have a different approach. So under the Australian government's emissions reduction fund, only 19.6 million tons of forest carbon offsets have been issued since 2012, but the government has actually contracted 68.8 million tons. So that actually, Australia typically makes up a huge portion of what we track every year in our reports for the last few years. And you can see in contrast in New Zealand, where it's not the government as a buyer, but many small buyers, they've actually had a lot more offsets being issued, but not as much being retired each year. And that's just because the buyers are very different. In Australia, it's the government, and they have a large amount of money sort of set aside to purchase these offsets. And in New Zealand, it's individual companies that are being regulated under the cap and trade program who are purchasing allowances or offsets. So it's just kind of interesting to see the differences between the two. And then finally, I just wanted to end with this map. So this map shows forestry, voluntary, and compliance programs around the world. And it's kind of interesting. I think if you look at this, you can see that there are a huge number of forest carbon projects in Australia and in New Zealand. This is sort of one of the findings we found in our forest carbon report, was just that the presence of compliance markets can have a really big impact in terms of the creation and development of forest carbon projects. That being said, however, many of these projects, especially in Australia and New Zealand, are quite small, especially I think those in New Zealand. So in terms of the actual number of hectares being covered, probably the handful of projects in Brazil could potentially be larger than all the ones that we see in New Zealand. But it just is interesting to see how government compliance policies can have an impact in terms of on-the-ground project creation. So with that, I'm going to move on, to our panelists, who are going to talk a little bit more about what they're seeing specifically in Australia and in New Zealand and in the Pacific Islands. So we're going to start first with Dr. Tim Moore, and I'm going to try and share my screen with him. Okay, and he's based in Australia, so he'll be giving us an Australian perspective.
Thanks very much, Kelly, and thanks for the invitation to be part of the panel. A quick whip around. Thanks for the insights into the markets. Can you see my screen clearly there, Kelly?
I can see it.
Very good, thank you. So I'll give you a quick whip around from a reasonably biased perspective, in that I'll present the views of biodiverse carbon conservation and our views of the market in Australia as we see it currently stand and how we see it moving forward. I suppose that I can give you the take-home message now is that we see that from a biodiverse revegetation perspective rather than a plantation forestry perspective, which is where we see the universe, we're really seeing massive increase in interest in biodiversity that also is complementary to food and fibre production. So we're not looking at competing with food and fibre production systems, but actually complementing that across really large landscapes. For some reason, there we go. So a quick overview of who we are, where we operate, why we operate. BCC, Biodiverse Carbon Conservation, is a joint venture social enterprise. And so we're made up of two shareholders, Greening Australia, which is Australia's largest on-ground environmental not-for-profit, and Australian Integrated Carbon, who are a financial services trader. We operate projects all over Australia. And the reason we run our projects is because we're interested in seeing people, nature and the economy thrive. We know that when landscapes are resilient, communities are in better condition, the economy is in better condition, and we can keep people on country to keep taking care of landscapes in the way we need them taken care of. And we're talking about big landscapes. So just for context for our listeners today from around the place, we're talking really, really big landscapes where communities are really producing food, fibre and extracting value from other natural resources. So the Australian economy is significantly driven by food and fibre production and tourism. So we really, the clean green image is really important for the Australian economy. Briefly, across the national programs from Greening Australia, there are 5 core programs that run Greening Australia's narrative. So the Great Southern Landscapes, which I'll talk to mostly, for the most part in this presentation. Reef Aid, which is looking at taking care of all of the catchment issues that cause problems to the Great Barrier Reef. So you've probably heard some of the challenges the Great Barrier Reef is facing. The work of Reef Aid is to really fix up the land-based components of the problems for coral bleaching in particular. Tasmanian Island Arc. So we're looking at Tasmania as a refuge. It's an island that is a refuge for a lot of species, and climate changes and land clearance is threatening those guys. Thriving on Country, which is working with remote and regional communities, although they don't think they're remote, they think we're a long way away from them, because most of the Australian population is based in cities. So we're looking at also reinstating nature in cities through our programs. Here's the take-home message before we get into this presentation too far. Australia's really big. Our total emissions profile is relatively small. We're about 1.5% of total global greenhouse gas emissions, but we're prolific land clearers. So the total area of land cleared in Australia since European colonisation is on the order of about 92 million hectares. That's about 30% bigger than the land area of Turkey, as an example. If we look at the science and the conservation literature, it suggests that at least 10% of that needs to be reinstated in key areas and not specifically scientifically identified areas to reinstate biodiversity, rare and endangered species, threatened habitats, connectivity between patches of vegetation. We need at least 10%, preferably 30% would be a target, but if we look at 10%, that's 9 million hectares. That's about, for scale concept, that's about 10% bigger than the total area of Ireland in the EU. If we talk about the total carbon sequestration potential of around about 5.5 tonnes per hectare across that area, given that we're talking very, very large variation in rainfall and production between, sort of 1.5, 2.5 tonnes a hectare a year, all the way up to about 20. If we call the average about 5.5, it's about 50 million tonnes of carbon sequestered per annum, which would be about 10% of total Australian greenhouse gas emissions. So the opportunity is really significant. And just briefly, here's an image that shows the landscape and integration of carbon into carbon plantings and biodiverse carbon plantings into production landscapes. So here is an aerial view from a drone technology that we're starting to use increasingly in Australia, to just give you an image of how big the areas we're talking about are and how that integrates with existing production systems. Okay, current policy settings in Australia. Look, I'm gonna ask you to keep this image in your mind as I go through the next slide that Kelly started to touch on, because we really do start to feel like the dog chasing a tail. You have to ask yourself, why is that dog chasing its tail, and what's it going to do when it catches it? Is it going to bite it hard, or is it just a game? We've had over a decade of uncertainty. As Kelly's presentation pointed out, we had a series of emissions trading schemes proposed, implemented, and then wound back over the last decade. I think the first emissions trading scheme was formally committed to by the Howard government in 2007, and as Kelly's presentation showed, we've had a policy roundabout of emissions trading schemes, carbon taxes, and emissions reduction funds implemented, with a view to generally committing to meet a previously Kyoto or currently Kyoto commitment period 1 and 2 targets, and then the next set of targets emerging at 2020 from our Paris commitments. The commitment's there as a policy statement, but the policy settings aren't in place currently. I don't think that will allow Australia to meet its targets. The general view of most participants in the market is that the ERF is not sufficient to meet the target. Kelly pointed out a huge volume, the Australian dollar volume of credits that have been generated in response to the government investment. So it has been a really big investment, a big commitment by the Australian government, $2.2 billion into buying credits from the market at lowest cost. And the vast bulk of those contracts that have been committed have been through human-induced regeneration or avoided deforestation projects. So effectively, they're very, very low cost. There's not a lot of input cost to develop the human-induced regen. It's just opportunity cost of not doing something to that landscape. Given that they're happening in relatively low land values, it's easy for those farmers to make that decision to not log forests or let vegetation regenerate. not a huge biodiversity dividend happening there, but some good environmental outcomes. Some challenges there for the ERF. We've already seen some of the large contracts fall over. The $2.2 billion is all commitment by the government to buy credits when these project developers actually produce the carbon, which has been a great stimulus, but we're starting to run out of all of that really low cost carbon. So the humidity use regen and avoided deforestation, we don't think there's a huge amount of that left in Australia at the low prices. So sorry, Kelly, you're quoting prices in USD, I'll talk in AUD. At around $12, those humidity use regen and avoided deforestation projects were viable, but probably we've run out of most of those, and we see that the price is going to have to go up to start to draw more projects, and forestry and biodiverse revegetation projects in particular, into the market. There's a suggestion that the ERF is a long way short. The safeguard mechanism is one potential way that Kelly mentioned. The safeguard mechanism is one potential way for landholders or project developers to make good on their obligations to the contract, but we don't have any certainty around that. And so there's not much voluntary or no liquidity in the secondary market, or not much of a secondary market to talk about. So as a consequence, we've got more uncertainty, and there you get the dog chasing its tail within the market. So we don't really have much clarity on what's going to happen next, especially given there's been no commitment to further funding the emissions reduction fund. So most of that $2.2 billion is spent or has been committed, and not much of a view from the government on what to do next. With the safeguard mechanism, as Kelly pointing out, not being particularly effective at driving down emissions. Some general view that the Australian government has suggested policy around importing or allowing import of international units. There's a general feel that they're going to leave the heavy lifting for the 2030 Paris targets towards about 2025, when they'll start thinking about it again, which is a bit of a cause for concern for anyone seeking clarity in the market. If I start to switch our view over to biodiverse revegetation supply side, demand from landholders is one of the challenges. So helping landholders understand what's the right balance of biodiverse reveg in their production system. So obviously there's going to be trade-offs in giving up some land area for biodiverse reveg. And what are the trade-offs? What's the long-run marginal cost of production? What's the return on investment? And what are they giving up in return? So every landholder says also, what's the carbon price going to be? At which point you have to start talking about the policy uncertainty, and it makes people really quite uncomfortable. So more policy certainty from government would be really, really valuable in providing more impetus for investment into this space. It allows capital to flow to develop some of these projects. And one of the local challenges we've got, all the re-veg work we do requires local provenance seed. So seed supply is definitely a potential bottleneck for the projects we run. The interesting stuff that we're starting to see, and this is where I get excited about the market at the moment, demand side, we're starting to see some pre-compliance type conversation. Companies that have been around for longer than 10 years don't have a vision for their business operating for the next 10 at least. Outside of political cycles, you're starting to see organisations getting organised to prepare for some form of emissions trading or emissions reduction commitments in the absence of strong leadership from government. So we're seeing really interesting opportunities with the developing CORSIA international aviation commitments and carbon neutral commitments. We're starting to see power companies starting to have conversations about long-term hedging of their potential emissions targets under some sort of emissions trading scheme, some form of emissions reduction obligation. We're seeing more companies seeking to become carbon neutral, so they're learning about carbon accounting and they're looking for some future proofing. They're also thinking future forward compliance, as well as integrating biodiverse revegetation into their corporate social responsibility investment. Really interestingly, in the absence of strong action by the Australian government, we're starting to see precincts, cities, local governments, state governments starting to stand up and take on the challenge. I think that's something we're starting to see across America as well, where the federal government or the national government is not taking a strong lead. We're seeing non-state actors starting to step up. I think a really good example is the example of the City of Adelaide in South Australia. Commitment by the Premier and the government there to be carbon neutral, I think 2020 or 2025 is the target. That's really important. signal to the market, because they're probably looking for homegrown carbon, which is a great stimulus or a great driver. We're expecting to see, with those big companies and large corporates and governments taking a long-term view rather than a short-term political view of emissions reduction responsibilities, we're starting to see innovative finance. So with that scale of organisations becoming aware or taking a commitment outside of the political cycle, we're seeing a rise in new blended finance. So that blended finance that's starting to come from impact investors, superannuation funds that are happy to take longer tail investments at a lower rate than quick hit easy money now. And we're starting to see that investment blended with government grants and philanthropy as well. So really interesting blended finance opportunities starting to emerge. But I think what we can see is that it requires actual cash commitment from those buyers, and a commitment to invest, like the Australian government has done, to stimulate some of that impact investment market coming to the play. Also importantly, the Australian government is currently spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year in a parallel environment program to the emissions reduction fund. But that's just a massive drain on the public purse. So we see the opportunities for leveraging that into carbon market opportunities starting to emerge as government agencies start to talk to one another about joined up thinking. Final slide. Just looking forward, so that's sort of now and looking forward, we're working with one of the big Australian banks, National Australia Bank, to improve understanding of on-farm economics of reforestation and biodiverse plantings. We think that's really important from a variety of perspectives because we want to value add to farm enterprise production values. We're not competing with farm production values. So where trees on farm assist their production, so good for lamb and wool producers to have shelter belts for their young, for their lambing paddocks, for example, they make more money. So biodiverse revegetation actually helps value add to those production systems. We're seeking to share that knowledge with the primary producers about the benefits of that biodiverse reveg for their enterprise value. So there's an actual dollar value attributable to the carbon, but there's also an enterprise value where their business, their bottom lines improve through having biodiverse reveg on site. And this is going to help inform bankers in the valuation community of the enterprise value of trees. Commonly, banks see biodiverse revegetation as a black spot on the landscape because it doesn't make any money. So trying to improve the understanding of the enterprise, of the valuation community around the value of trees on farms. For us, the next 12 months are really about new partnerships across finance, government and philanthropy. So that impact investment starting to bring together sort of groups that wouldn't ordinarily be talking, such as not-for-profits and power companies and state governments and philanthropic investors all together in the same place to have a conversation about how do we make a difference and measure the impact. But typically, a lot of that grant and philanthropy money has been sort of gifted with the hope that something good happens. We're really talking about developing hard metrics that allow them to get a return on investment and scaling up as a result. Issues that we see coming up, there's obviously short-term politics, so the next state and federal elections will always have an impact on scale of market opportunities. One of the really interesting things that we're starting to see is Article 6, Paris Agreement, emissions trading post-2020 for Australia. It's going to be interesting whether the Australian government allows import of international units and export of ACCUs out of Australia. What that's going to do within carbon trading clubs across the region where Australia joins clubs, or whether state actors seek to join clubs as well. And hoping for something like a mechanism, safeguard mechanism, to turn into a real demand resource. Well, that's the end of my presentation, Kelly.
Thank you so much, Tim. I'm going to switch over now to Ollie Belton. So let me just make that change. Let's see. Okay, and Ollie should be able to take it away. And Ollie's with Carbon Forest Services, which is based in New Zealand. So we'll hear the New Zealand perspective.
Thanks, Kelly. First of all, have you guys got my screen up? Can you see?
Oh, I can't
Kelly,
see it.
Can you see that screen there?
No. Let me.
What have you got there?
I'll make myself presenter and then give it back.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Second time's the charm. This is after I promised Ollie this was a very painless procedure.
Okay, great. Okay, is that working now?
Yep.
Great. And can you see my mouse on there?
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Thanks a lot. Hey, thanks, Tim. Very interesting. And unfortunately, I'm going to be repeating some of the same things because we face the same issues, as I'm sure all of us in compliance and voluntary spaces do around the world, with policy and government uncertainty, which is affecting, which affects the market. So anyway, look, today I'm going to focus really on the compliance market in New Zealand because it really dwarfs the voluntary space. So we've had a really bad and dysfunctional climate change policy in New Zealand for a long time. The price had collapsed, and as a result, forestry was languishing badly and going backwards. But really, in the last 2 years, and especially in the last couple of months, there's been a big shift. So today, I just want to have a look at the past, and I guess hopefully that will inform us about what not to do and not what to repeat, and then also look at current developments and what the future may hold. So looking back, first of all, you can see on the slide on the left here, New Zealand, that's showing the afforestation and deforestation rates in New Zealand since 1990s. Now, in the 1990s, there was a huge spike in new plantings and very little deforestation. However, with log prices going down and increasing land prices and increasing returns from farming, this afforestation rate decreased year on year, and deforestation actually started to pick up. So by 2005, which is around here, we had for the first time deforestation, a net deforestation situation. That was more land was being taken out of trees than being put back into trees. This was really bad for the forest industry, for New Zealand's export earnings, but also for our climate change intentions, because New Zealand had hoped to meet its Kyoto Protocol targets using forestry removals, and actually thought would be in surplus and would be able to sell the surplus to other countries and make a profit. So we partly, I believe, that's why the ETS was brought in, was to stem the flow of the deforestation and put on a deforestation penalty, but also to provide a financial incentive to new forests by giving carbon credits out to encourage people to plant new trees. So yeah, did it work? Well, yes, initially it did. You can see it in 2008, 2009 when it was brought in. We've got here this massive decrease in deforestation, and then of course a slow increase, because there's always a lag with planting, of a year or two of new trees being planted. So there was a lot of enthusiasm, and everybody thought it was carbon and the ETS was going to save forestry. Then in 2010, we had a new centre-right government come in, the National Party. Now, they very quickly diluted our ETS. Kelly's explained around the 2-for-1 subsidy, for example. They also excluded agriculture. But despite that massive hobbling of our system, there was still enough encouragement there. And foresters joined the scheme, and at its peak, I think we had about 60% of the 100,000 hectares of eligible forest join. And there were some really important developments around the climate finance space. For example, emitters had the confidence to go out and lock themselves into very long-term contracts, in some cases up to 15 years, offtake agreements to take carbon from forest owners. And look, the price of carbon still maintained a pretty good price, and we can see on the right, that's the NZU price in NZ dollars from 2010 out to the end of 2017, so end of last year. All looked okay until about July 2011, and again, Kelly mentioned the collapse of international UN credits, which went rapidly down, dragged down the NZU with it, and that's because New Zealand was one of the only countries in the world which completely had unrestricted access to overseas credits. So the price completely collapsed and actually bottomed out down here to around $1.50 in 2013. And at that stage, people thought it was game over, and many people actually thought that the government would scrap the ETS and had no interest in seeing it succeed. Foresters left the scheme in droves, participation dropped to about 40%, and deforestation once again was on the rise. Now you can't see in the chart on the left, but actually in 2013, deforestation eclipsed afforestation, and that was an ongoing trend. So there was a shift, and that started in just around 2014, and that was because New Zealand had not joined the second Kyoto Protocol commitment period, and therefore the UN basically said, if you're not going to join the Kyoto Protocol, you cannot use these cheap units anymore. So incidentally and by accident, New Zealand locked itself out of these cheap units. Now you'd expect the price to jump up rapidly as a result, but it was actually pretty slow. As that June 2015 date, when New Zealand was to become a domestic-only scheme approached, the credit price was still pretty subdued. Still, the feeling was that our government was not committed to having a high carbon price. And then you see actually the price rapidly increased, and that was because of a couple of things. The first thing was New Zealand government did take a commitment target under Paris, and although some say it was unambitious, it was still relatively difficult to achieve. And second, we had a new Minister of Climate Change who started to really change her tune in terms of ambition. And one thing that was brought out was the announcement that the 2-for-1 subsidy to emitters was likely to be chopped. Now, that would increase demand, basically double it. So as a result, the market took note and tripled basically within about 5 months. Nonetheless, the forest industry and landowners really had lost faith and were pretty wary of these ongoing changes in flip-flopping. And we had these two major risks hanging over our heads. And this was, the government said that it actually wanted to use foreign international credits to meet its Paris 2030 target. And also it wanted to auction units into the market. So both of those things would potentially increase supply and weaken price. So now we are going into 2018. Now things are completely different and have changed rapidly within 3 months. And that's because we have a new centre-left Labour-led government with a coalition with the Green Party. Now, things were already looking good with under the previous government, with the phase out of the subsidies and a firm target under Paris. There was also, by the way, some changes that were in the wind and are still under review around carbon accounting for forests. Currently, if a forest is harvested, you have to pay back 75 to 100% of all the units issued. Now, that's paying it back at an unknown price in the future when you harvest. So that is seen as a massive hurdle and perceived as a big risk to a lot of forest owners and is stopping participation. So some new rules have been considered, which would basically what's called averaging, and it means that the forest owner would earn credits up to maybe the first 20 years of a forest life and then never earn credits after that. That would also not have that sting in the tail of a harvest liability. So all of these things basically mean it looks pretty good anyway, but the new government's come in and had a raft of new policy announcements, and the price has really jumped again. And actually yesterday, the price traded at $21.25 New Zealand, which is the highest price, I think, recorded in our emissions trading history. So changes that the government have announced, well, they've said they want to establish a zero carbon act to set us on path to being a net emission neutral economy by 2050 and have these targets set in law. They want to set up an independent climate commission to recommend these targets, and our Minister of Climate Change recently hinted that the current cap of $25 in our ETS could be under review this year. Now, the big thing for forestry is that the government has said that it wants to plant 1 billion trees, which is basically 100,000 hectares a year over 10 years to meet some of these ambitions. And so really that would be returning us back to the same level of plantings as the 1990s. So what does this mean for the carbon forestry sector going forward in New Zealand? Well, it is very good for current forest owners, but whether it actually leads to an uplift in new plantings, I am a little bit cynical. I mean, first you've got a major physical and financial hurdles, and that mainly is sourcing suitable land at the right price. But the real major issue here is the instability and constant shifting in climate policy between the major parties. I mean, the past decade has been a disaster and left a very bad taste in the mouth of carbon investors, consultants, foresters, landowners. We've all been burnt and remain pretty wary. So really the issue is the carbon market is a political construct, and therefore the price is vulnerable to changing political will. New Zealand has very short 3-year term governments, and forestry is a long-term investment and needs long-term certainty in policies stability. So really, to achieve more forestry in New Zealand, we need to have cross-party climate policy consensus between our major political parties to restore the confidence and goodwill back in those willing to invest in trees. So thanks, Kelly. That's it for me.
Thanks so much, Ollie. It's I always find trying to track what's going on in New Zealand and Australia very interesting because there are so many policy developments, but very concerning from a climate point of view, but interesting from a researcher point of view. But with that, I'm going to then shift over to Sean Weaver, who's with ECOS. He has some projects in New Zealand, but also in the Pacific Islands. So let me unmute you. And Sean, let me know if you also have difficulty with getting the screen to show up. You should see a box appear.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. I haven't seen the box did come up, but I was just editing something then, and so I said go away to the box, and now it's disappeared. So I wondered if you could send it to me again.
Let me try again. Let's see.
Yeah, there we go. Show my screen, and then I'll get my presentation up. So can you see that screen now?
We can see your screensaver, and oh wait, it looks like the PowerPoint is, yep, it's right there. Perfect.
Oh, great. All right. All right, thanks, Kelly, and also thanks, Ollie, for your presentation. Tim, international voluntary market, but it strongly is buying carbon offsets for purposes of getting carbon.
Sean, I think you're cutting out a little bit. Can you try maybe repeating what you just said?
Yeah, sure. Okay. I was just saying that hopefully this will go through okay. Even though I work in the voluntary carbon affect the voluntary market because carbon bonds and neutralities.
Sorry, Sean, you're still
carbon
you're still cutting out a little bit. Let me. Do you think you could try calling in with your phone, perhaps? I don't know if that was included in the email.
I'll do that now, so it might as well get some good communication. So what's the number that I need to bring?
I'm going to resend the email really quickly, resend the invitation. I think there should be a phone number.
Oh, yeah. I'll find it. Phone number, I'll do that now. 1 and 5.
Of course, now it seems that I can hear you fine. That's always the case, isn't it? Thanks, everyone, for your questions.
Anyway, just because I keep trying to do it, but that's why I'm on the phone line.
I can hear you a little bit. It just seems like it's cutting out a little bit.
Okay, well, I'll still try. If you just give me a minute, I'll just try and get this phone number dialed.
Okay.
More asking a minute. And now your screen.
Yeah, that's fine.
I'll get the number I'm trying to ring. Okay.
In the meantime, while you try and call in, I'll just answer. I see a question that's listed that I can answer right now. Someone was just asking that they were saying that the New Zealand carbon price is $17 per ton. Australia through the ERF is $13 per ton. And in my presentation, I was saying it was $5 per ton. So one of the questions is, do we think that the price will increase? And will there be a standard global price per ton for carbon? I think everyone would love to see the price increase. However, the difference in pricing is specifically sort of mentioned by the questioner is a difference in part between the voluntary and compliance markets. And I think in general, we do see more stable prices in compliance markets. But of course, as I'm sure everyone has figured out by listening to both Ollie and Tim, stable prices in compliance markets are only as stable as the policies themselves. And of course, it's highly variable depending on government action or inaction around these markets.
Can you hear me now, Kelly?
I can. Let me try and make you the presenter again. And yeah, and if you can just bring up your PowerPoint again, perfect.
Okay, so hopefully this will be a bit clearer. I'm getting a bit of an echo, but we'll just persevere.
It sounds great on our end.
Great. Well, again, thanks, Ollie and Tim, for their presentations. And as I said before, or tried to communicate before, I share similar frustrations watching governments make a mess of a really clever form of economics that can really make a difference. But anyway, in the voluntary carbon market, where I do most of my work, we are affected by compliance carbon pricing because voluntary carbon buyers can buy compliance credits when they want to do their offsetting. So when in New Zealand you could acquire carbon credits for sort of US 15 cents a tonne at one stage in 2015, it just made it really difficult for people in my situation to compete with that. But now that the compliance price has risen up, that also makes it better, especially in the New Zealand market. But anyway, I'm going to focus this presentation on the work I'm doing in the Pacific Islands, and that focuses on essentially delivering climate change resilience in the countries that we're working with through forest protection and forest finance carbon markets, so climate change and climate change as delivering climate resilience. As a structure, ECOS is the charity that I operate out of New Zealand, and we co-own an entity called the Nakau program, which is also jointly owned by Live and Learn International, which is an Australia-based international sustainable development NGO, which has independent country offices across the Pacific and Asia region. And we've developed the Nakau program, which is a Pacific Island regional forest carbon program with EU funding between about 2012 and 2015. We're at the moment certified to the Plan Vivo standard, which is a community-based forest carbon standard that focuses on carbon, community and biodiversity benefits wrapped together in projects. One of the key drivers of our work in the Pacific is, as I signalled before, to deliver resilience to these communities and especially resilience to climate-related natural disasters. And the region is very heavily impacted by cyclone threat. This is an image taken after Cyclone Pam, a Category 5 storm that hit Vanuatu a couple of years ago. A year later, another Category 5 storm, the biggest on record in the Southern Hemisphere, hit Fiji. And they caused widespread damage. Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu left a quarter of the population homeless. Cyclone Winston in Fiji a year later caused enormous damage to that country. And what communities find is that if they still have key ecological infrastructure in place in the form of rainforests, then they can survive those climate shocks with a lot greater resilience. So, for example, In Fiji, we have a project in the Central Highlands of Vanuatu, on the second largest island of that country, and Cyclone Winston smashed apart their community, smashed up the houses, destroyed the crops. They're quite a remote community, so the roads were badly damaged, and so they were quite isolated. And yet, because they still had their rainforest, they were able to, the day after the cyclone, go and forage for fish and prawns in their rivers, which were still running clear, and also forage for food in the forest, and have a Sunday feast on the Sunday after the cyclone hit on a Saturday. So just a little anecdote, but it's actually quite an important principle of the great value of forests as ecological infrastructure for climate resilience. So we are protecting and enhancing forests in the region through our Ngakau program, and to do that we've developed 3 pilot projects, and they're pilots in the sense that they're the first of their kind in their respective countries. They're proof of concept projects with the goal of then scaling up to several more projects each per country, and ideally becoming embedded in the national forest cover programs in those. So there's each of official national pilot projects as part of the National Red Plus programs. So we've got one project in Fiji, which I mentioned to you just a moment ago. We've got another one in Vanuatu, and 2 sites in the Solomons, which we're managing as a single project. But just to illustrate the type of project we're doing, I'll just quickly go to the Vanuatu project. For those of you not familiar with Vanuatu, it's located to the west of Fiji in southeast Solomon Islands, and the project site is on the island of Espiritu Santo. But the main theme is, and similar to Tim's work, this is combining biodiversity benefits, community benefits. So this particular forest has 2 critically endangered species, coconut crab and the Vanuatu megapode, which is a ground bird, flightless bird that builds a huge compost heap for a nest. But in all their economic development goals, the way it doesn't require them to cut their forest down. So, in these communities, they need to finance community economic development. Typically, would be that through logging and land clearance, because traditionally that's the economic development. Our project is give these landowners an opportunity economic development. So our projects are very much community development projects that use financing tool, and as a result, you're getting 3 for the price of 1. You're getting carbon benefit of the atmosphere, and key benefits, which I'll go into in a minute, and also biodiversity benefits from the protection of these ecosystems. From a community point of view, we spend an awful lot of time and effort developing or strengthening community-based project level governance, because if the communities cannot make transparent decisions about participating in a carbon project, then that increases the non-permanence risk of a project. So we improve governance arrangements in those communities. We help clarify land tenure arrangement, clarify roles and responsibilities, using free, prior and informed consent principles. They're very strong participatory, but we also coach these communities in financial discipline and community business development. In contrast to logging, where the logging company writes a check and then leaves the community to decide how and doesn't report unless it's a community exercise. What a lot of capacity building in the community so that they can make informed decisions about reinvesting capital inflows to things going to financial resilience through time. So, for example, reinvesting carbon revenues in other community-based enterprises is an important part of what we support in these communities. So, for example, increasing the capacity to run a community business enables those communities to run other community businesses. So, for example, in Fiji, the community there is developing a honey business, and the carbon revenue is helping to co-finance that honey business. In Vanuatu, it's an agroforestry business. In the Solomon Islands, it'll be honey, some copra, coconut oil production, that.
Oh, sorry, Sean. I think you're cutting out a little bit again. Can you try just repeating what you said for the slide?
Key in terms of the scale of our activities, at the 50,000 tonnes a year for 3 projects that we've got 2020. We've got 3 additional projects going up in the Solomon Islands, but we've also got potential to substantially increase this volume through this programmatic approach that we've developed in this arrangement we're calling the NACAL program. But in terms of looking forward and how we can really take advantage of the potential opportunity, our projects in size and scale and replication really is dependent on demand and these things. Development free market, but also can include government market. But one there is all these markets, and that's been a challenges. So for a start, there's demand for the sort of scale of carbon credits we're going to be producing in the region. Large in these countries, so we need to try and access other markets. One of the barriers we have at the moment is that they're certified listed as an the International Carbon Offset Alliance, and that means us to do wholesale market.
Sorry, Sean, I think
want credits to be accrued.
You're cutting out again.
Listed, did you?
Is there, I don't know.
Okay, this is.
Is there a window nearby you can try and get the cell reception from?
No. Well, it's a landline, so I can do my end.
Okay, sorry, keep going. We'll cross our fingers.
Okay, I'll try and just go a bit slow. This is on my last screen anyway. So to move things to the next level, we really need to find ways to ideally access larger markets, gain a CROA listing, and I'm working with Plan Vivo, and Plan Vivo have been negotiating with a CROA for some time now. Or we could upgrade to the VCS standard, and that would open up opportunities for us. But ideally, we'd want to be able to get involved in some government transactions or access the CORSIA markets with the international aviation sector, although their trading rules are not available at present. But one of the other major challenges is how we integrate our project and program-based approach with national either NDCs or national RED Plus programs, and especially in a region where the capacity of these governments is relatively low. So those are the major challenges that we face, but things are looking a lot better than they were a year ago. So that's my last screen. So there we go. Thanks for listening, and sorry about the communications challenges.
No, and thanks for your patience, Sean. At the end it sounded crystal clear, which I guess is always the way of these sorts of things.
Cool.
But thank you for that presentation. I just wanted to mention very briefly for the audience, because a couple of our panelists mentioned this, and I want to make sure everyone knows what it is, but CORSIA is the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. So basically, with the Paris Agreement, countries from all around the world, with the notable exception right now of the United States, agreed that they would take action to combat climate change. However, absent from this global agreement are two things: international shipping and international aviation, since those aren't really bound to a certain country. So CORSIA is basically the international aviation community coming together and creating their own market that will probably be very reliant on carbon offsets, simply because there aren't that many forms of sustainable jet fuel available to the market at the moment, and most airlines have already tried to max out their efficiency. So anyway, I noticed a couple people mentioned CORSIA, so I wanted to make sure that was explained. But I think now we can turn to questions. I know we're running a little over time, so if anyone has a question but can't hang on to the call, just write it in the question box, and I can make sure that our panelists or that myself, depending on who the question is addressed to, can respond. But otherwise, I think if our panelists don't mind, we might go a few minutes over, and my colleague Melissa Gallant will be moderating the questions. So Melissa, you can take it away. Perhaps.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Sorry, yeah, that's yes.
Oh, good, okay. Great, so yeah, right now we've got just one question. And it's really, I guess it's for everyone, especially for Tim and Ollie. Apart from clear policy, what are some of the key actions that state governments can undertake to support the carbon offset industry?
Thanks. Tim, do you want to have a crack at that first? Or?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ollie. Look, I think the role of non-national actors, also state governments and councils and large corporations that sort of operate at scale, need to be engaging with the market. So they need to understand what the challenges are for project development. They need to understand that, as Sean's presentation pointed out really eloquently, if you want carbon credits from revegetation or biodiverse revegetation or forestry in 3 years' time, you need to start planting now. And so there is a lag there, so the governments, actors that are interested in the other outcomes that come with forestry projects need to be operating now for a future outcome, with the benefit, obviously, that there is a long lifetime of those projects. Policy setting is really valuable. So policy setting backed with cash is even better. So that, a commitment to partner with part of the blended finance opportunity. So state government don't need to take on full responsibility, but they can participate with other operators in the market, in the finance sector, across impact investment, across social enterprises, across not-for-profit, across philanthropy. So innovative partnerships coming together that state governments could start to organise, because they do have the breadth and capacity to carry the governance and overheads that come with those discussions. And I think finally what state governments could do is give some clear direction about where they want credits to come from, because markets are international. So just this discussion today is just the Oceania part of the world. Agents need to, and we can effectively buy credits from anywhere, but where do we want them to come from? I think China's probably the only part of the world we can no longer access, because most of the policy in China is sort of suggesting no credits to exit China at present, which makes it harder to access. But at the moment in Australia, we can access credits from every part of the world. So I think some direction from governments on where they seek that investment to come from would be valuable. Ollie?
Yeah, thanks. Look, we had an interesting experience in the NZ ETS when it first launched. There was that enthusiasm there. It really started to work, and we actually saw the private sector step in and create, sophisticated financial instruments started to arrive and appear. The banks were very keen to lend to invest in new forests, but all that rapidly disappeared. And look, we've lost 10 years basically of that innovation. and now there's a lot of people wary about it, including those institutions and banks. So I think the private sector can deliver the finance, but it's crucial to have those policy settings right. Definitely the government can help, like our government has got an afforestation grant scheme where they effectively underwrite and give us $1,300 a hectare to help establish new forests. So there's that part, but then on the other side there's the physical and regulatory constraints which are completely unrelated to carbon or climate policy, and that's around really policy around forestry. And in New Zealand things are getting more and more difficult in terms of local government regulation and national legislation at looking at how you can plant forests and where you can. So we need to have all the different parties, local government, central government, business, everybody really talking together, because we are having some interesting outcomes where we've got a government who's just said they want to plant 1 billion trees, and yet we've got local government telling investors, no, you can't plant that there, and we're jumping through the hoops. So yeah, there's the climate finance, carbon policy, but there's also a broader range of regulatory considerations that really are inhibiting more forests going in the ground.
Great, thank you. And Kelly and Sean, do either of you want to weigh in on this as well?
Well, I could certainly give a comment because I do a little bit of work consulting for a local government in New Zealand, and I certainly agree with Ollie on his point that there's a range of different policy enabling factors that need to be lined up, and I think getting the current New Zealand government and the fact that those regional governments have also been the council that motivated to settle that. So, for example, if the market works as a role of some working together, you get an efficient system with increasing uptake, and then the market really moves. So, when I say stick, saying to people, land that ought to be farmed and should be trees. So these sorts of things are really important. And talking about this to rather than governments making policy in an echo chamber.
Thanks, Sean. Good, so we've got a couple more questions here. One, do you think that carbon from biodiversity sells at a premium to non-biodiverse plantings? And do you have any examples of that?
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure the other two will have lots of examples of this, but absolutely, in the earlier years of my career in this, I focused more on I guess call it sexy carbon with the additional benefits around biodiversity and so on, and definitely managed to trade at a premium to plantation forests in New Zealand. But this is really in the space of voluntary markets. In the compliance market, unfortunately, we've tried for many, many years to get compliance buyers to pay a higher price for pure native forest restoration projects, for example, which they could then use as compliance credits in the ETS. So far to date, it has been a real hard slog, and generally it always comes down to money and what they're answerable to shareholders, these big companies, and it doesn't fly. So that's our experience. Yes, in the voluntary space it can work, but when it comes to the big volumes that are trading in the compliance market, it's about volume and it's about low price, which is the attractive thing to the buyers.
Yeah, reflecting those sentiments, absolutely. We are doing, so the carbon credits we generate in Australia are effectively all going into the voluntary market. We're not putting anything into the ERF anymore, just because the prices there are low, and we're attracting a really, really serious premium in the voluntary market. We're buyers fully recognise the value that biodiversity represents. So the ancillary, or the other core benefits rather than co-benefits, I guess. And absolutely don't expect those premiums to prevail in a compliance market where vanilla, the markets of vanilla, that they're ambivalent as to where the project comes from if you're looking at a compliance play. So we really need to see compliance prices move closer to where we think the real price needs to sit. I mean, we're running out of human-induced regen projects in Australia, which are viable at $12, $13. And the real cost of production is a fair bit higher for the rest of if you look at across the carbon production cost curve in Australia, it's a fair bit higher than that, given land values and reduced production in biodiverse systems compared to monoculture planting. So yeah, we don't anticipate doing those massive volumes in compliance markets just on biodiversity value alone, but hope to see compliance prices come up to allow us to deliver those biodiverse outcomes.
Not sure if you want to add. Oh.
I'm still on my call and I'm doing my best and I can't.
So Sean, it's still a bit difficult. How about we I can follow up with you and get the information from you written down, and then I can follow up with the person who asked the question, so they can hear you and actually hear what you say.
Yeah, and we'll do that for all the questions that we don't get to today. We'll follow up via email too. But I think we'll do one more question here, and then we'll wrap it up. So this is open to everybody. For the voluntary standards, can credits be generated from existing healthy natural forest ecosystems, or is it more related to degraded and greenfield sites?
To start off with a response to that one, the voluntary or carbon project in the voluntary market is avoiding emissions, which is a wee bit like fossil fuel avoidance project, like a wind farm, where you're avoiding the emissions of fossil fuel. And if you're avoiding logging of forests, then you can generate carbon benefits that can be certified to an international standard. And also governments are developing, and the World Bank is also developing, the carbon trading rules for reducing deforestation, forest degradation, and you can do forest enhancement as you can in a compliance market. So the voluntary market has a broader spectrum of activities that you can use.
Yeah, sorry, Sean, again, that was quite hard to hear. Maybe I could add a little bit, and sorry if I'm repeating stuff that you might have said, but yeah, in terms of the projects for existing healthy forests, yeah, I guess there's kind of two main ways forward. One would be avoided deforestation if the forest was legitimately under threat, then by locking it up and maybe buying the timber concession, if there was such a thing, then you could generate credits. And then the other way is if you could improve that healthy forest by improved forest management, but you'd have to establish a baseline and then show that through your actions you'd actually increase the amount of carbon stored within that forest, and then you'd be able to potentially get the benefit of the difference. But other than that, no, I'm not really sure what else you could do.
Yeah, and I think the key question there comes down to for any voluntary project looking to protect an existing or an extant forest, the question really does come down to what's the imminent risk of loss. So there's a huge amount of vegetation in Australia. I can think of one state in particular the state government has done a fantastic job of legally protecting existing forest and remnant forest that's never been cleared. But that the owners and landholders that have that forest on their land, given that it's legally protected, have no carbon opportunity. Really, it's a bit of a blessing and a curse for those landholders. But unfortunately, there's really not much you can do about it unless there's an imminent threat of loss. There's not really a carbon opportunity for either for improved forest management or avoided deforestation.
Yeah, just to clarify,
we have,
for our work in the...
Sorry, Sean, you go for it.
Yeah, an example of imminent loss, in the Solomon Islands, we're in a race against the Malaysian logging companies who are trying to tear down every last stick that's on the landscape. And, the baseline situation for the country is comprehensive and systematic forest loss. So turning that tide is through carbon projects is a very useful way to challenge that sort of situation of forest loss, and that's exactly why we're working in those countries.
Look, I was just going to add that, like what Tim just said about the example that he has encountered in Australia, we have the same in New Zealand. Pretty much most of our old growth native indigenous forests are now protected under the legislation, and it's pretty onerous protection. So there is really no argument to be able to say, look, this is at risk of being cut down because it's illegal to do so. So yeah, it pretty much been locked out of that opportunity in New Zealand because of the protections. But that's a good thing because these forests are secure and legally protected, and we've got a not corrupt system in New Zealand, and they're enduring. So it's a win-win.
Yeah, so absolutely, the climate benefit. Yeah, the climate benefit and biodiversity dividend coming from that strong governance arrangements is fantastic. And there are some landholders that feel a bit aggrieved about voluntarily entering into covenants that legally protect their land under that vegetation protection. They feel a bit aggrieved that they haven't been able to generate any revenue out of their goodwill, but unfortunately that's just the nature of having a strong legal governance arrangement.
Hi, yeah, just adding one more point of clarification for on Ollie's point about New Zealand forest, because I've got a forest carbon project in tall forest and I've got others in development. And even though they can't be cut down, they're not allowed to be clear felled. They can be logged under the Ministry for Primary Industry rules. And I think it's an important point to clarify that carbon projects can and are happening in that space, where instead of being logged under Ministry for Primary Industry rules, those forests can be protected. But the carbon credit volume you can generate per hectare per year is quite low because the Ministry for Primary Industry rules are reasonably robust, but nonetheless you can, and we are creating certified carbon projects in New Zealand in that space.
Sounds like Australia's got something to learn.
Happy to share.
Yeah, happy to get you over to Canberra to educate some of our policymakers.
Happy to come over.
Great. Well, I'm glad we can share some of the policy happenings. I hope some of the listeners also learned some new things about what's going on in New Zealand and Australia, and also the Pacific Islands during this webinar. But I just wanted to thank everyone for participating. We do have a few more questions that I don't think we'll be able to get to because we're quite over time at this point. But never fear, we will be following up via email with the answers to your questions. And of course, if you have any other questions or want to reach out to anyone directly, our emails are on this intro slide I have up right here. But otherwise, thanks again. We will have this recording available on foresttrends.org. And I hope you all have a very good day or evening if there are any other North American listeners on here. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Kelly.
There you go.
Thanks, Kelly.